Okay, let's unpack this 15-fold. That's quite a staggering increase in daily or near daily marijuana use over the last 30 years.
It really is.
And get this, in 2022, it actually surpassed daily alcohol use, first time ever.
Yeah, that statistic really turns heads.
It does. So with that kind of surge, you naturally have to ask, right? Does more use mean more cancer risk? That's what we're digging into today.
Exactly. And to get a handle on it, we're looking at the current science,
Mm-hmm.
drawing from a recent synthesis, looking at findings from places like the American Cancer Society, ACS, and the National Academy's NASEM,
Right.
plus key studies, from major journals, Lancet Public Health, JAMA Otolaryngology, Cancer Epidemiology, JAMA Network Open. Important stuff.
And just to be clear, we're focused on what the science says, not like personal takes.
Precisely. It's about extracting the evidence.
Yeah. Our mission here is really to cut through the noise, lay out the clearest evidence we have on marijuana and cancer. Because, I mean, public perception shifting, use is way up.
People need clarity.
Exactly, without getting totally bogged down in, super technical jargon.
Makes sense. And the starting point for a lot of people seems pretty logical, doesn't it? Marijuana smoke, well, it has many of the same carcinogens as tobacco smoke.
Right, it feels intuitive. Smoke is smoke, bad stuff is bad stuff. You'd think the cancer risk would track similarly.
You would. But
Not
here's
really.
the twist, and it's a really interesting one. Despite that chemical overlap, the studies we have so far haven't actually confirmed a broad, definitive cancer risk for marijuana use.
Which is kind of counterintuitive.
It is, and that leads to a really important point from Dr. Nygaard Nargis at ACS. She said, essentially, insufficient evidence doesn't mean the risk isn't there.
Ah, okay. So it's more about what we don't know for sure yet.
Exactly. Sets the stage perfectly. We're exploring in an area with known unknowns.
Got it. So a big piece of this puzzle was that 2017 NASEM review, right? The National Academy's one. What did they conclude back then?
Yeah, that was a landmark report. Their main finding was modest evidence connecting marijuana use to one specific subtype of testicular cancer.
Okay, just one specific type.
Right. But, and this is key, they found a lack of significant association for lung cancer and head and neck cancers at that time, which, as you said, are often the first ones people think about with smoking.
So not the wide-ranging link maybe some expected. You mentioned limitations in those earlier studies, though. What were the big problems?
Well, NASEM pointed out a few key things. Many studies were, frankly, quite small. They often relied on surveys, asking people to remember their cannabis use, which isn't always accurate or detailed.
Right, recall bias.
Exactly. And critically, so many marijuana users also smoke tobacco, trying to separate the effects of one from the other. Really, really difficult.
Yeah, I can see that. Like trying to unmix paint.
Sort of, yeah. That's a big part of what Dr. Nargis called the huge knowledge gap.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so that was 2017. Let's fast forward. What about head and neck cancers? You said the picture wasn't clear then, but has newer research shed more light?
Yes, this is an area where things have evolved a bit.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 2024 study in JAMA Otolaryngology head and neck surgery that took a different approach.
Okay, how so?
They looked at medical records for a really large group of people, specifically focusing on those diagnosed with cannabis use disorder.
Ah, so a specific population. And what did they find in that group?
Well, what's interesting is they did see a higher incidence of head and neck cancers in that group compared to controls. Now, these cancers are still relatively rare overall,
Sure.
but over a 20-year period, the rate was roughly 3 times higher in the group with cannabis use disorder.
3 times higher. Okay, that sounds notable. Was it across the board for head and neck or specific types?
Good question. After they adjusted statistically for things like age, tobacco, alcohol use, they found a risk somewhere between 2.5 and 8.5 times higher overall for head and neck cancers in the use disorder group. And laryngeal cancer of the voice box showed the strongest link. The risk ratio was over 8 there. Others like oropharyngeal, salivary gland, oral cancers also showed elevated risks.
That does sound pretty concerning. But Dr. Meyerowitz-Katz, our consulting expert, he had some caveats about this study, didn't he?
He did, yes, important ones. While he noted the large sample size as a strength, he pointed out first, this study is only looking at people with diagnosed cannabis use disorder.
Right, which might not represent casual or moderate users.
Exactly. That's a huge potential difference. And second, the study didn't have data on other factors, like occupation. We know certain jobs carry risks for head and neck cancers, and maybe those jobs correlate with cannabis use patterns, We just don't know from this study.
That's a really crucial point. And didn't he also put the risk into perspective in terms of absolute numbers?
Yes, that's vital context. He pointed out that even if you take the findings at face value, it might mean something like 3 out of 1,000 people with cannabis use disorder develop these cancers, compared to maybe 1 out of 1,000 without it.
Okay, so the relative risk sounds big 3 times or even more, but the absolute change is from, say, 0.1% to 0.3%.
Precisely. It's important perspective. So the takeaway isn't necessarily cannabis causes head and neck cancer, but rather in this specific group with diagnosed disorder, we see an elevated risk. Whether that applies more broadly, still an open question.
Got it. Really important context. Okay, let's pivot slightly. Another area raising concerns is prenatal exposure, cannabis use during pregnancy, and childhood cancers. We
Mhm.
know prenatal use is increasing,
Yes, that trend is definitely happening, and it makes understanding potential risks really crucial.
but studying this must be tough.
Incredibly tough. Childhood cancers are rare, thankfully, so you need huge studies. Plus, asking parents to accurately recall substance use during a pregnancy years later, especially after a child's diagnosis. It's very difficult.
So, how are researchers trying to tackle this?
Well, one recent study, 2024, in cancer epidemiology, biomarkers, and prevention, tried a different angle. They didn't track cannabis use specifically from the start. Instead, they surveyed families of kids with cancer about general illicit drug use during pregnancy.
Okay, so broader than just cannabis, but likely including it.
Right. The researchers assumed marijuana would be the primary drug in many cases, but it could include others.
And what did they find with that approach?
They found an association between that reported prenatal illicit drug use and a higher prevalence of two specific rare tumor types, intracranial embryonal tumors, things like medulloblastoma and retinoblastoma, which is an eye cancer.
How much higher?
The prevalence ratios were nearly double for the brain tumors and over 3 times higher for the retinoblastoma among kids whose mothers reported illicit drug use during pregnancy.
3 times higher again. That definitely raises a flag.
It does. And interestingly, in that same study, they looked at prenatal cigarette smoking too.
Yeah.
No association found between prenatal smoking and those specific childhood cancers.
So it suggests maybe it's not just about the act of smoking something.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And this is but everyone agrees we need much more research focused specifically on prenatal marijuana use and these childhood cancers, including animal studies to figure out how it might even happen biologically.
Right. These are preliminary signals, not conclusions. Okay. Let's circle back to testicular cancer. That was the one Nizam flagged back in 2017. What's the latest there?
Yeah, testicular cancer still seems to be the one with the most consistent, though, again, not rock solid, link.
Yeah.
A 2019 meta-analysis in JAMA Network Open did connect long-term use defined as over a decade with a higher risk for a specific type, non-seminomatous germ cell tumors.
Okay, long-term use, specific type. Sounds more defined, but were there caveats there too?
Oh, absolutely. The authors themselves rated the evidence strength as low.
Low? Why?
It was based on just a few relatively small studies. And Dr. Meyerowitz-Katz pointed out that these studies didn't do a great job controlling for other potential factors.
So the same problem again. Is it the cannabis or something else that long-term users might be doing or exposed to?
Exactly that question. It makes it hard to be certain about causation. Does it hint at something real, especially with long-term use, or are we just seeing noise from study limitations?
Okay, so a potential link, but still shaky. What about broader studies looking at population trends?
Well, the 2025 review by Dr. Nargis mentioned a 2021 study that did find correlations at the population level, like places with higher overall marijuana use seem to have higher rates of testicular cancer.
Interesting.
And it even suggested higher rates in U.S. states where marijuana was legal versus where it wasn't.
That seems potentially significant, but I sense another but coming.
You sense correctly? Dr. Nargis rightly cautioned that these population-level studies, these ecological studies, they can spot trends, spark hypotheses, but they can't prove cause and effect for an individual.
Right. You lose all the individual detail, who's using how much, what else are they doing?
Precisely. So useful for pointing fingers, maybe, but not for definitive proof.
And the why, the biological mechanism that's still up in the air too.
Largely speculative, yes. We know there are cannabinoid receptors in the testes. Some lab evidence suggests activating them might mess with hormones or testicular function, but a clear pathway from smoking a joint to developing testicular cancer, that's not established.
Okay. So testicular cancer. Most consistent signal, but still weak evidence overall. What about other cancers? Anything else emerging?
This is where the evidence gets even thinner, really quite preliminary. That Lancet Public Health review did mention some emerging hints from a few observational studies. Possible links to breast, liver, thyroid, prostate cancer.
Just hints, though.
Very much so. And then there was that perspective piece from a research team in Australia.
Ah, yes, the one claiming compelling evidence that cannabis damages DNA, genotoxicity, and therefore increases cancer risk. That sounded strong.
It did sound strong, but again, Dr. Meyerowitz-Katz provided crucial context.
What was his take?
He stressed it was a perspective piece, not new data. It was essentially reinterpreting the same limited evidence pool that NASEM and ACS had already reviewed and found wanting.
So basically arguing for a stronger interpretation of weak data.
That seems to be the assessment. He wasn't dismissing any risk entirely, especially maybe with heavy smoking, but his conclusion based on current evidence, the risk, if it's real at all, is likely quite small.
Okay, so for other cancers, we're really in the realm of speculation based on very limited signals right now. Which brings us to the big question, what next? How do we get better answers?
Yeah, the consensus is clear. We need large, long-term cohort studies. Think like the Framingham Heart Study, or the big studies that nailed down the smoking cancer link decades ago, following lots of people over many years.
And ACS is planning something like that.
Yes, they're planning to analyze data from their existing cancer prevention studies. They have info on cannabis use and verified cancer diagnoses in large groups of people. That could be really valuable.
That sounds promising. And we have to remember it's not just about smoking anymore, is it?
Absolutely critical point. Dr. Nargis really emphasized this. We know next to nothing about the long-term risks of vaping cannabis or edibles, tinctures, all the newer methods.
Yeah, most research is on smoking flower, right?
Overwhelmingly. So as these other methods get more popular, we're entering a huge blind spot in terms of long-term health effects.
And the rules, the regulations, they're struggling to keep up with all these new products.
That's Dr. Nargis' concern, yeah. Product development is racing ahead, but the regulatory framework and the research assessing safety, they're lagging behind.
So what's the bottom line here? What's the main takeaway or responsibility?
Dr. Nargis put it very powerfully, I thought. She said it's basically the research community's responsibility to find the truth, to figure out the real long-term effects so people can make properly informed choices about their health.
Right. Okay, so let's just quickly wrap up the key points. Marijuana use. Way up. Carcinogens in the smoke. Yes, similar to tobacco, but clear, broad cancer link like tobacco. Not proven yet.
Correct. The 2017 NASEM review saw maybe a link for one type of testicular cancer. Newer work hints at head and neck cancers, but specifically in those with cannabis use disorder. Lots of caveats there.
And the childhood cancer link from prenatal use, very preliminary signal based on general illicit drug use, needs much more specific research on marijuana.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Other cancers. Evidence is even weaker, more speculative. And the big caveat over everything is the limitation of past research, small studies, trouble separating out tobacco use.
Definitely. So considering everything, more legalization, more use, all these unanswered questions, especially about new products, it leads to our final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah, think about this. With all this uncertainty still floating around about long-term cancer risk, what's the responsibility here? For individuals making choices, for public health bodies trying to guide people.
And how does the fact that people are vaping, eating, using cannabis in so many different ways now complicate that picture even further? It really highlights the urgent need for research to catch up, doesn't it?